Welcome to a Men of His Word audio recording. Men of His Word is a conference that equips Christian men to take a leadership role within their family, congregation, and community. Go to menofhisword.org to find information on upcoming conferences and resources. This breakout session is entitled Every Member Evangelism. It was given in Oshkosh on February 17th, 2024. Roecker is the director of the WELS Commission on Evangelism and has been a pastor for 25 years.
When I presented at the WELS youth rally, last youth rally, and all these high school students, no one would answer. They just stared at me. And then finally one young man raised his hand, and I was like, what made you choose this breakout? And he said, well, my mom signed me up late and there was only one left with room. Oh, that's a great encouragement to me. Thank you for your honesty. Well, I am glad you chose this one, and I'm glad to see men in our church body eager to not only do evangelism, but get every member involved in evangelism. And just a little bit about me and my background. This is my family. My wife, Mary, she works as an industrial engineer for Quad Med. My son, Reese, is a junior at Martin Luther College studying to be a pastor and obviously playing a little bit of football. And my daughter, Riley, is a senior at Luther Prep School, planning to go to Wisconsin Lutheran College in the fall. I graduated seminary in 1998, and at seminary, when you graduate, they announce where you're going to go, and you have no idea where they're going to send you. And they announced Virginia Beach, Virginia. I'd never heard of it, but boy, that sounded pretty good. It's a beach, it's on the East Coast, and here was the church I was assigned to, Resurrection. Great church to begin a ministry, about 200 souls, and a 5,000 square foot building, and we just had a blast, did lots of evangelism, a lot of outreach. The Lord blessed that, and in 2007, we relocated to build a larger church to nearby Chesapeake, about 5 miles away. And this was awesome, not only because it gave us 4 times as much space in our building, but this building was right on a main commuter road. So I think that first year we had something like 450 first-time worshipers. Like every Sunday there was a new family worshiping with us. So that was a really great opportunity. And then 2013, accepted the call to Pilgrim in Menominee Falls. Pastored there for 5 years. That was a new experience for me because we had a school of about 100 kids, preschool about 40, congregation about 550. And so that was a new experience for me. And then 2018, I accepted the call. This is our Synod's office building in Pewaukee. This is where I work now every day. And so I serve as the director for the Commission on Evangelism. So my full-time job is to help WELS congregations and WELS members to reach the lost in their community. So I'm really privileged to be doing that on your behalf, actually. So I thought we would start by trying to talk a little bit about how is evangelism going in the WELS? How are we doing reaching lost souls? And this is a challenging thing to measure because you really can't have statistics on evangelism. Right? For a couple of reasons. One is, none of us knows how much evangelism is actually going on in our congregations. Because a lot of it is personal witnessing that's going on, and we don't know about it. So you can't measure that. And you can't measure the work of the Holy Spirit. Right? We don't know what He's all doing with our efforts. He does things behind our backs and out of our sight all the time. Well, that's a hard thing for me because, raise your hand if you're familiar with Strength Finders. So it's a personality evaluation tool, and it identifies what your strengths are. There's 34 of them possible, and your top 5 are the things you're the strongest at. Well, apparently my number 1 strength, I found out, is competition, which I call the sinful nature strength, because I not only want to do well, I want to do better than everyone else. And so it's really frustrating to me that you can't measure evangelism, because I want to win at evangelism. So we really don't have a good measuring tool. The only tools I know of that might give us an indication are adult confirmations and adult baptisms. Adult confirmations are people who come into our churches from outside of Lutheranism, and adult baptisms are kind of an indication of reaching true unbelievers. Because if they're not baptized and they're an adult, it's a good chance they don't know their Savior at all. So I just want to look at some statistics about adult confirmations to give us some sense of how we're doing with evangelism in our churches. So these are some statistics that, at least for me, were a bit startling. 2002, the percent of WELS congregations with 0 adult confirmations. Any guess what percent of our congregations did not have a single adult confirmation?
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
What's the difference adult confirmation and profession of faith? Is it profession of faith from outside of Lutheranism and adult? Or anyway, just...
Good question. Interestingly enough, I found out that pastors look at this differently, but I think the way that I've always looked at it is generally the way most pastors do. If someone comes in from another Lutheran church body like Missouri Synod, we called that a profession of faith because they'd already been confirmed as a Lutheran. But if they came in from outside Lutheranism, like Baptist, Methodist, non-denominational, then we called that an adult confirmation. So that's how I measured it. Yeah. So what do you think? Any guesses? Percent of WELS congregations that did not have a single adult confirmation in 2022. Please. 50%? More than 50%? 80, 60, 90? So what's been interesting about this for me is when I've asked this question, WELS members appear to be significantly more pessimistic than me. I thought, if 25% of our churches didn't have a single adult confirmation, that would be bad news. But I'm finding out that WELS members think it's even worse. So it was 46%. I feel like that's a significant statistic because if there are no adult confirmations, that says something is going on. Percent with 1 or fewer adult confirmations was 54%. And percent with 3 or fewer. So obviously these churches are doing something. They're reaching souls. Souls are coming in through confirmation. They're not booming, but hey, they're getting 3. So 3 or fewer is about 70%. So if you are getting more than 3 adult confirmations a year, you are in the top 30% in the WELS. So I looked at this and thought, we've got a lot of work to do when it comes to reaching lost souls. I think as a church body, we have a lot of work to do. But there are some congregations that are reaching lots of lost souls. And what do you think the percentage is of WELS congregations with 10 or more adult confirmations in 2022? What percentage do you think? 20? Was 8%. So obviously, if you're getting double digits in adult confirmations, you're really in the top tier of blessings in this area. And then I looked at what about the congregations that are really being blessed when it comes to reaching lost souls? What kind of adult confirmations are we looking at there? So this is a list of the top 10 WELS congregations in adult confirmations and the number of confirmations that they had. So you can see there's some places that are really, really being blessed. The church that had 84 in 2022, we just looked or just got the stats for 23, and that church recorded 108 in 2023. So obviously there are some places that are really being blessed in this area. Here's a question for you. Why are some congregations so evangelistically blessed while so many others are not? Turn to the person next to you and discuss that for a moment, please. Hey, Joe.
Your job is ministering
Just out of curiosity, how many of those are outside of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan?
I think 7 are in the Midwest
7 are in
of the 10.
Midwest?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think so. All right, thank you. Thank you for those conversations. Is this on? No, there we go. Thank you for those conversations. I am curious what you think. Why are some so blessed and others aren't? In the back, please.
I think so. I came from Boise, Idaho, and out there they didn't have an established Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod presence that was out there, and so there were a lot of denominations that started to come into that church. So I think location is a big piece of it.
Okay, location. What else? What else did you discuss? Please.
I'm going to say location. When you get bigger, old WELS congregations, they have to do a lot of maintenance ministry, and evangelism sometimes gets pushed to the bottom.
Okay, thank you. Joe?
Yeah, that's what we were saying. The established congregation that, their mindset is maintaining and shepherding their existing flock.
Yeah. I can say this. It was different for me as a pastor of a 200-person congregation in Virginia, and then we ended up 650 souls, and I was the only pastor in Menominee Falls. That's a very different animal. Others, what did you discuss? Please.
The number of people involved doing the evangelism, and if they even have an evangelism committee, decides to also.
Okay, thank you. Please.
narrowly defining sin as sins of commission and ignoring sins of omission, and then leaving out God's command to go into all the world, and that includes my neighbor.
Interesting. So it's not talked about and not repented of if it's not happening?
Or, it's not always talked about in that way. You should do evangelism. We don't always talk about the sin of not doing evangelism.
Yeah. Gotcha. Anything else you discussed? Why do you think this? Please.
I think that when you do have an evangelism committee, the people at congregation think that they're going to be doing all the evangelism, and it's not a each one kind of a thing. They would be in trouble.
Okay. They're the ones doing it. That's not my job,
Right.
kind of thing. We're going to talk about in a minute about some things maybe we can do to increase the evangelism and every member evangelism in our congregations. But before we do that, whenever we're talking about comparing congregations, there's some things I think are important for us to keep in mind. The first one is, Paul says, God has been making it grow. We planted the seeds, but God made it. We have to keep that in mind, right? I know we know that as Lutherans, but especially in the area of evangelism, that finally it's God who does the harvesting. And so there's just some places he blesses more than others for his own reasons. That is a reality. In the early church, Acts chapter 3, the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. The Lord did that. Now, what's interesting is just before this passage, it talks about the activity of the Christians in Jerusalem. So they were active and they were doing things. I'm not saying we aren't responsible for doing things, to your point. But just keep in mind that it's the Lord who makes things grow. And if he wants a church to grow, then he will make it grow. He has that power to do it. Another thing to keep in mind is we don't want to compare apples with oranges. And that's easy to do, to think that this situation should be the same as that situation, when they're not. So we have to be careful of that. Geography can have a huge impact on outreach. So I was in Chesapeake, Virginia, which was, I would call it church interested. A lot of military, a lot of transplants that were there, a lot of people who were Christian conservative minded. So there were a lot of people looking for a church. That's why we had 450 first-time worshipers when we relocated. My classmate got assigned to Barrie, Vermont. And I remember early in my ministry talking to him at a conference, and he said, Eric, I can't I can't even get a conversation with anyone. He said, this part of the country, no one is thinking about religion. It is not on their radar. So it would be unfair to compare Chesapeake, Virginia ministry to Barre, Vermont ministry, right? So again, just got to be careful about that. The church situation as well, right? If you're in the metropolitan area, I live in Menominee Falls, and it is booming. I mean, they can't build houses and condos fast enough in our area. That is going to be different from a town of 500, and you've got 300 of them that are your members. So to compare, again, we have to be careful of that kind of comparison. Even something as seemingly similar that I found. So in Chesapeake, when I went around and knocked on doors, I usually did it to invite them to something like Easter. And most of the people that had moved in those new neighborhoods had moved in from somewhere else in the country. When I did that in Menominee Falls, in the brand new subdivisions, most of the people I met said, well, we moved from Wauwatosa. And they already had a church, and they were going to stay at that church because it was 15 minutes away. Well, that's a difference, right? So again, just an urban setting where maybe the whole demography is changing around you as over the decades go by, that's going to be different. And finally, there are different gifts in every church. Right? Each pastor has different gifts. The members have different gifts. The history gives it different gifts. When I got to Virginia, we didn't have a keyboardist of any kind. We had an organ, but we had to run it with a computer. That was a challenge. We didn't have that gift in our congregation. And you had a knuckle-headed green young pastor who thought it would be a good idea to chant the Psalms with a computer-run organ. And so when that got programmed in, it was programmed in at a certain tempo that couldn't change. You just hit play and it played it. So the congregation's like running to get to the end of the line if it's too fast. It was a train wreck. We didn't have those. When I got to Pilgrim, a year after I got there, we received a graduate from MLC who has a master's in church music and is a ridiculously gifted musician. So every church has different gifts. So these are just some caveats I think we need to keep in mind if we're going to look at those statistics. We want to be careful about not comparing apples and oranges. That being said, it is also true that we can learn from each other. Maybe there is something from that church over there that we could be doing, and I can learn from it. And maybe there is some value in looking at the churches where God is blessing them. Are they doing some things other churches might want to think about doing? In fact, today, we're going to try to gain some insights from a non-Lutheran source. That's okay. The doors are closed. We're going to look at a non-Lutheran source that I found interesting when it comes to what churches seem to be blessed when it comes to evangelism. And it's a book called You Found Me by Rick Richardson, which is a fantastic name. Rick is big in the evangelical world. He is an evangelism guru and also studies a lot of statistics. Raise your hand if you are familiar with the book, The Rise of the Nuns. That number is getting lower and lower over the years. It came out about 10 years ago. The Rise of the Nuns, Nones. And it was a study of Americans. How many Americans, when they're asked what religion they affiliate with, how many of them mark none? Nones. And that number has risen dramatically especially since 1990. I think in 1940, 5% of Americans were not affiliated with a religion. 5%. 1990, it was 8%. So in 50 years, it only went up 3%. But from 1990 until about 2017, that number went up to about 25%. And the younger a person is, the better chance they're not affiliated. People 34 and younger, 40% of them are not affiliated with a religion. 40%. So there are far more unchurched people. That book came out in 2014, and the Christian world went, American Christians especially. It was a wake-up call. Rick did a similar study in 2019 got similar results, but he came to kind of a different conclusion. His conclusion wasn't we should panic. His conclusion was people aren't going to church, but they are interested in spiritual things. So there's a huge opportunity to reach these people. It's just going to have to be differently than we did in the past. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the gist of his book. And in the book, he puts forth an equation that they studied 3,500 Christian churches in the United States. And this is the equation that they discovered. Those are the fancy boxes on your handout. That missionary leaders in a congregation and a missional congregation, when you have those two things, it results in a conversion community. Now, if you're like me, you're uncomfortable with this wording. This isn't how Lutherans talk. So I wanted to make sure, what is Rick talking about? Because this is not our kind of language. Here's what he means. His definition of missional leaders is this. The leaders in that church model personal outreach, and they model integrating an evangelistic concern into the ministries they lead. These are leaders who are all about evangelism. They do it, they talk about it. Not surprising, right? What does he mean by missional congregation? He means an entire culture that engages with people outside the church, brings them in, and extends spectacular hospitality when they visit. I like that phrase, spectacular hospitality. It's not like, well, the doors are open, we hope people visit, and if they do, someone might say good morning. It's spectacular hospitality. And then secondly, this engaged, invitational, hospitable culture characterizes the congregation as a whole. It's just who they are. So he says when you have those two things, it results in a conversion community, which he describes this way. The congregation is growing. Unchurched people are coming to the church and staying. Outreach and witness are integrated into every ministry and priority the church has. By the way, that second one, unchurched people are coming to the church and staying. I recently spoke with a pastor and his wife about their church's evangelism, and they said that their biggest problem is people are coming, they don't come back. They said only like 1 in 10 comes back. Now, it could be that is just a result of those people's sinful nature and they don't like what God's word has to say. It's possible. But if I was in that church, I would do some serious thinking about the way we're doing what we're doing. Because if only 1 in 10 are coming back, something is making that happen. But in these churches, people are coming back. So this is the equation he came up with. It's not really surprising, is it? I'm going to suggest that missionary leaders in a missional congregation could also be described as a church that has an outreach culture. And I think I can say that when I look at WELS congregations, that those top 10 congregations, the ones that I know anything about, that is kind of their culture. It's just who they are. So, question, what can we do to help this happen? How can your congregation be helped to have missional leaders and a missional congregation? How can that be helped? Well, interestingly enough, in Rick's study, they interviewed 1,500 pastors of growing congregations in the United States. They took all that data, and then they did a regression analysis, which means they looked at all the input and they pulled out of it anything that was an outlier. So if a pastor said, well, we've got this huge VBS every year and thousands of kids come and we really get a lot of members from that, they would pull that out because it's unique to them. Does that make sense? And they ended up finding 10 what he calls predictive factors, which is apparently extremely rare in looking at statistics. Normally you get things that are probable, but he says, based on their study, every time a church has these 10 things in place, it always is growing. So, we're going to look at those 10, but before we do, I'd like you to see if you can guess what some of them are. So, try to think of as many factors that you think are in place in growing congregations, and try to think of at least 2. Turn to the person next to you and chat about that, please. Okay, thank you for those conversations. Let's wrap them up. And what do you think? What is it? One of the factors, do you think? What did you discuss? Who'll share? Please.
The leaders lead by example.
Leaders lead by example. Awesome. What else? Please.
The machinery of the church doesn't consume the leadership.
The machinery of the church doesn't consume the leadership. Interesting imagery.
Members are put to work.
Members are put to work. Okay. Anything else? Would you discuss?
Good music reception.
Good music. Anything else?
I think you have a training program to train your members how to talk to people.
Training for evangelism. Cool. Yes.
Active community programs like soccer camp, PBS, those types of things. Youth programs bring people in.
Okay. Community programs. Cool. All interesting ideas. Let's talk a little bit about what they discovered. These are the top 10 predictive factors. And I'll leave this up at the end for a little bit if you want to take a picture of it. The church invites, includes, and involves the unchurched. Not surprising. The pastor regularly teaches a next steps class, which we would call our Bible information class, I think. The pastor regularly attends evangelism training. The pastor regularly personally evangelizes. The church puts its money where its mouth is, into outreach. Members, and not just the pastor, are reaching out. The pastor translates the sermon to unchurched people and their lives. The church ministry engages the community. The church culture attracts transfers as well as unchurched people. I found that one interesting. That it not only is attracting unchurched people, it's attracting people from other churches. Which kind of isn't surprising. If a church is doing well and people like it, probably everyone will. And the pastor blocks out time in his calendar to personally reach out. So I'll leave that up for a moment. I am going to... Oh, please.
It's interesting that out of 10 things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are all focused on the pastor.
5 of the 10 have to do with the pastor. When I presented this slide to the seminarians 2 weeks ago, that was an interesting discussion. You said that's interesting.
I think it puts a large burden on the shoulder of the pastor.
Yeah, we are developing. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of a program called Everyone Outreach. Some of you have. So that program we developed to help congregations build an outreach culture. While we were developing it, I told my partner Kurt, who I worked on it with, I said, "This is great, but we really need to produce something for pastors in particular because they have such a big impact on the culture of the congregation." So right now we're working on a program that we hope that we're going to bring to all the pastors in the WELS in the next few years, talking about the pastor's role as culture shaper in the congregation. Not just in outreach, in all areas, but a lot of it is his shadow. He casts a big shadow. I'm gonna make. Oh, please. I'm sorry.
Do we teach people to say no? Everyone has good ideas what churches should do, and we don't say no to the good but not important things.
No.
And in so doing, we have death by 1,000 paper cuts.
We generally, I think, don't do that very well. We say yes to a lot of good things, but it's hard to prioritize.
I might encourage include that in the training.
Yeah.
Say no.
Yeah, you hear stories like Pastor Rosenau, who's down in Florida. His church is one of the top 10. And so let me put that in perspective. Almost 50% of our congregations didn't have a single adult confirmation in 2022, right? His congregation has, in the last 10 years, has had 262 adult confirmations. So they're averaging 26 a year. So what's the question that comes to mind when you hear that? What are they doing? So his outreach strategy that he taught his congregation is, he said, I will have the best sermon and worship I can on Sundays. You invite people. That's their whole evangelism plan. And he follows up on them. Now, he has certain gifts I don't have. Maybe he's uniquely gifted just as each of us is. So I'm not promising those same results, but I just find it interesting that that's their outreach plan. In fact, when he got there, he tells the story, he got there and it was in the fall, his first fall, and one of the members of the church said, well, Pastor, this is the weekend we go to the local county fair and hand out invites to church, and it's an invite that says, if you come to church, we'll give you a free Bible. And he said, oh, how long have you been doing that? He said, about 15 years. He said, how many Bibles have you handed out? Well, none yet. And so, to your point about saying no to things, he said, well, I don't want to do that. He said, how about this? How about you and I agree that each of us will invite one person to Christmas Eve service? Which they did, and if I understand correctly, both people did come. So with 2 invitations, they got more people to visit their church than 15 years of handing out invites. I just find that interesting. So evaluating what you're doing and saying no to the things that aren't impactful is a great point. I'm going to suggest, Rick doesn't do this in his book, but I'm going to suggest that there's one of these that's the most important, and the other 9 support it. And I think it's number 6. I think that's the most important one, and everything else supports that. If the pastor is doing his part and doing it the right way, it's going to support and encourage members to do evangelism. And if the congregation is doing things that make it easier for members to invite people, then your number 6 is going to happen. Does that make sense? So that's my contention. As I just said, if the pastor's doing his part and the church is doing its part, then you're going to have more likely every member evangelism. So, let's talk a little bit about missional leaders. We can't talk about everything that's on the pastor's plate, but maybe we can talk about a couple. Oh, look, someone predicted my question. Of course, 5 of them are the pastors. The first one I want to talk about is that the pastor regularly personally evangelizes. Why is this important to every member evangelism? That the pastor is doing evangelism personally himself. Please.
Because he will speak to the members of the congregation when he tells them the little stories of what he experienced.
Yep. He's got stories. Anything else?
Got to lead by example.
Got to lead by example. Don't tell people to do something you're not willing to do. Please.
Makes him human.
Makes him human.
Yeah.
Especially if he's telling stories about his evangelism and some of the ways that he failed. Right? Because if every story is a home run, then people just think, well, he's the pastor. I can't do that. For example, we have neighbors down the road from us who are Vietnamese from Vietnam. They've lived here since 1970s, but never churched, no idea what Christianity is, and we became friends with them because our dogs met. And when we took our dog for a walk, they played with their dog. So we've gotten to know them, and we just asked them a lot of questions, but I couldn't figure out how to turn it into a discussion about Christianity. And a couple of falls ago, I was in my backyard kind of having some prayer time, just walking around and thinking about things. And I was really frustrated that I hadn't figured this out. And I just said, Lord, you need to do something here because I can't figure out how to turn this into a religious conversation. Then I started feeling the guilt that I hadn't. And then I started thinking to myself, you're the director of evangelism. How can you not know how to do this? Interestingly enough, a week later, we were handing out candy at Halloween with Tony and Kim, and out of nowhere, Tony started asking me about being a pastor and Christianity. So that was kind of interesting. Thank you, Lord. But the point is, that's a story I can tell as the director of evangelism saying, hey, if you ever feel like you're not sure how to turn something into, hey, you're not alone. We all get to those places. I found that when I was doing personal evangelism the most is when my members were inviting people most often. When I look back at my 20 years in the parish. That's kind of the way it went. And I think it was because I talked about evangelism a lot. I shared those stories in the pulpit and in Bible class and in casual conversations. I just was so fired up. I loved talking to people who were unchurched. And sharing those stories, people caught on to that. And if in those periods where I wasn't doing as much evangelism, members weren't inviting people as much. So I think there's a strong correlation there. Please.
How much of that do you think is related to people pigeonholing evangelism as having the right answer as opposed to being relational?
I think, first of all, many people think that. Secondly, I think that my telling stories about conversations helped maybe break that down a little bit. Because the two things that WELS people tell me the most often that are challenges when it comes to evangelism. One is they're afraid they won't have the right answer or the right Bible answer. They don't know the Bible well enough. And secondly, the second one is people say, I don't have any unchurched friends. I don't know anyone that's unchurched. All my friends are at church. So those are two interesting challenges that lots of people have. But like you said, if the pastor's telling stories about his relationships with unchurched people, that tells members you can do this too. All right. Discuss how active your pastor is in personal evangelism and discuss ways to help him become more active. Turn to the person next to you and just have that conversation quickly. Okay, thank you for those conversations. Let's wrap them up. Now, I'll leave to you in your private conversation how active your pastor is. Some of you might say, I have no idea how active he is, which maybe says something if you don't know how active he is. By the way, we should also keep in mind that every circumstance is different. I can tell you that I had a lot more time for evangelism with 200 souls than I did with 650 and a school of 100. What I don't think I did very well at Pilgrim was make that happen. Yes, it was more difficult, but all my time could be consumed by the congregation very easily. I should have prioritized it and said, regardless, I'm going to make it happen. I didn't do as much as I should have. But the circumstances are different. How might you help your pastor be more active in personal evangelism? Thoughts on that? Joe?
Free up space on his plate so he can do that.
Free up space on his plate? Cool. Anything else that you discussed?
Hold them accountable.
Hold them accountable. Okay. So both of those bring to mind a story that Pastor John Hine tells. He was out in South Carolina and started a mission congregation. And he would give his council a report of what he did with his hours during the month. And as they grew larger and larger, eventually the council mentioned to him, Pastor, we noticed you're not doing as many evangelism visits. And he said, well, look at what else I've got compared to years ago. So they came back the next month and said, Pastor, we talked about it, and unless it's a deathbed situation, you're not going to make hospital visits anymore. You're going to train us to do that so that you can do evangelism. I have mixed emotions on that. One is how cool that they were willing to step up and make sure he had time to do evangelism. Then I thought, or maybe they could just do evangelism. But as uncomfortable as a hospital visit might be, they were probably even less comfortable with evangelism. Any other ideas of how you might help your pastor in this regard? Please.
Well, for us at our church, we're growing we're turning from a mission congregation into an established congregation, and as we grow, we have to keep reminding that we need to start taking those duties off of our pastor as our congregation is still growing. Mm-hmm. And so that's on the membership, not just him.
And I appreciate you saying that. And I hesitated to show I'm like, why should I have these men, leaders in these congregations, talk about the pastor at this conference? But then I realized, actually, there are things that you as leaders can do to help your pastor, hold them accountable, or some pastors, it's not their thing. They're not naturally. That's not their inclination. But you can encourage them and say, I realize this isn't your sweet spot, but it is important. We want to encourage you. Just give them that encouragement. John Hine, again, who was in South Carolina, knocked on something like 4,000 doors a year. and he's an unbelievable introvert. I mean, John Hine can come in, I've seen him do it, come into his office at Synod, sit down at 8 o'clock, walk out at 5 o'clock, never move except to get his lunch. Just type. He's super prolific, super gifted, but even though he was an introvert, he said, that was my call. That's what God called me to do. And so that's what I did, whether it was easy or not. So there's some of that too. Another story that I heard I found interesting, a pastor was at their annual meeting, and they were discussing the budget, and he got up at one point and he said, we have all this money for evangelism, we do these different things, and sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't be better if you just gave me a beer and burger budget, and I went around the taverns in town and met people. Everyone laughed. That night, one of the couples who had been at the meeting called him and said, Pastor, we'd like to fund that. We think that's a great idea. So they talked about it, and what ended up happening is that couple paid for him to be in a Wednesday night golf league in town. And he's been doing that for the last 5 years and met tons of men from the community. I just thought, what an interesting way. That's a direct way that members help their pastor to be able to do more personal evangelism. Now, I can tell that story and not want anything from it. I love golf, but I don't have a congregation, so I don't have anyone to pay for that.
I think that ties in with something else. I think sometimes pastors think they have to be about so much of church work, and members think, well, we need you doing this, this, and this, that there's no time left for a personal life, which means you don't have time to be in a golf league, which is actually stuff like that, hobbies, how are you involved in the community, is how you meet other people outside the church, which all that ties together.
Absolutely. Again, coached my son's Little League team in Virginia and met tons of people at his public school there. At Pilgrim, my kids went to the school. I was the pastor at the school. I wasn't involved in anything in the community. So just have to be intentional about it. All right. The next one I wanted to share is that the pastor translates the sermon to unchurched people in their lives. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because most of you aren't pastors, but I just think this is absolutely critical. If you want your members to bring unchurched people to visit, and that's what we want them to do, every sermon has to be accessible, meaning every sermon has to be able to be understood by an unchurched person. And I say every sermon because if it's just here and there, your members aren't going to invite people. They're not going to be able to trust that I know every sermon. Someone asked when I presented this at seminary, what if it's a sermon on money? Giving. I think even that can be written in a way that an unchurched person can appreciate. So my best, no offense to my seminary professors, my best sermon writing professor was Melanie. So Melanie was a young woman invited to our church early in my ministry. She was in the Navy, and one of our members was a friend of hers in the Navy. He brought her. She came to church Sunday, came to my new member class Thursday, found out she had no background in church at all, never had been to church, didn't know who David was, didn't know who Abraham, nothing. So when WELS people, lifelong WELS people like me say, I don't know the Bible well enough to do evangelism, she's my answer, because in the 8 weeks after her first visit, she brought 18 different people to church with her. 18 in 8 weeks. You couldn't know less than Melanie did about the Bible. But she just was so excited. Also made me feel bad at the time because I was like, in 28 years I haven't brought 18 people to church. She just did it in 8 weeks. But also, once I knew that about Melanie and I knew she was going to come back, especially those first few months, every sermon I wrote was to Melanie. Because that was, after I studied the text and started writing the sermon, I thought, I have to make sure Melanie can understand this. And that was super good training for me. It also helped that after a month or two of that, I had more compliments on my sermons from members than I had ever had before, which also told me something. That when I write it so Melanie can understand it, it probably means my members can understand it better too. Someone had their hand up, please.
We learned something. My friend Mike is along with me today, and he's a new member of our church.
Welcome, Mike. Awesome.
But he and I have discussed this topic because if we have a big class of 10 to 12 people, then the pastor mostly discusses and there's an occasional question. When it was just Mike and myself, Mike talked all the time because he had so many questions. I couldn't keep up with him.
Yeah.
And I thought, boy, there's quite a lesson there.
Mm-hmm.
I learned all the things that, I assumed, and Mike helped me clarify.
Oh, yeah. What a blessing it is to interact with folks from a different background from your own, or an unchurched background. I mean, things that Melanie would ask, I would never. Well, my friend Tony from down the street, we were talking one day about the Bible. He said, well, how many pages are in the Bible? It's a silly question to us, but it's a perfectly reasonable question. Then I brought my Bible out and showed it to him, opened it up, and he pointed and he said, what are those big numbers? Can you know what chapters meant? So things like that. How can you help your pastor with this? I guess ask your pastor if he's interested in a feedback of some sort. Or maybe your pastor's already really good at this. Encourage him. Thank him for that. But I think that's a critical one. I did want to talk a little bit about these four, which are, the church's role rather than the pastor's role. We obviously can't talk about all of them. The one that I was going to talk about is inviting, including, and involving the unchurched. And the idea there basically is more and more that your church is looking for ways to be part of the community. It can be little things like maybe instead of your church picnic, it's a community picnic. Just naming it that can actually make a difference. I'm not saying it's wrong to have a church picnic. Sometimes we just want to fellowship with each other. That's okay. But be intentional about it. Maybe there's other ways that you can be involved in the community. Our church, on occasion, would do a cleanup of the nature preserve near us. We go out there and just get out there with people who aren't members and show that we care about the community. That's a good one that you can brainstorm at your congregation, which we don't have time to do now, unfortunately. A couple of tools that might be of interest to you as you look at getting more members involved in evangelism. This is the one I mentioned earlier, Everyone Outreach. This is a program designed to help build an outreach culture in your congregation so that outreach is just kind of who you are as a congregation. Building a culture takes time. This begins with a weekend workshop, but really the hard work is post-workshop when you're doing things and thinking in ways that make outreach more important. So that over time, like have you ever tried to change a habit? It's hard, right? And it takes time. Same is true of a culture in a congregation. Over time, though, if you're doing and saying things differently, doing and saying things in an outreach fashion, eventually that will become who you are. So you can find a lot more at our website, everyoneoutreach.com. And then here are 3 Bible studies that might be of interest. All of them are video-based. They're all free. Video-based Bible studies that can be used in large groups or small groups. 1 by 1 is based on Dave Rosenau's presentation at the Leadership Conference in 2019. That's a real inspirational one about how God builds his church one person at a time. Let's Go. I would say that one is the most instructive in here's how to do personal witnessing. Love the unchurched people in your life, listen carefully to them, and lead them to the gospel. There's 7 lessons. 3 of them are on how to actively listen and how important listening is in evangelism. So then the third one is sort of a general evangelism, a personal evangelism, in season and out of season. I'll just give you this warning. When we filmed that one, we did it for 3 lessons. But if you have the conversations in that class like you should, it'll probably be 4 or 5 lessons. So just be aware of that. We should have packaged it differently. But those are 3 options. And maybe you do one a year. Maybe you do one every 6 months. I actually think you could rotate these, depending on your size congregation. But if you're in a larger congregation, you could offer one of these every 6 months and just keep rotating them. People could come back for a second time, or people who missed it the first time can come. And if you have other questions about personal witnessing or how to get that going in your congregation, this is my contact information. Feel free to contact me at any time. This is when we were supposed to have questions, but we're out of time. Sorry. So if you want to stay after, I'm here when we can chat. I'd be happy to do that. Thanks, everyone. God bless.
If you found this useful, the greatest gift you can give us is to pass it on to a friend. These recordings are free because of the support of our donors and sponsors. To visit our sponsors, to donate or to volunteer or to find more recordings, go to menofhisword.org. James and Timothy Rudot helped record and edit these episodes, and I am John Rudot, the technical manager for Men of His Word.